At 7:42 on the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft return from Pearl Harbor. The task force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, maintaining strict radio silence for the entire 12-day voyage across the North Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers steamed in formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers had accompanied them, the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. The carriers were pitching gently in the Pacific swell. The morning air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal from recovered aircraft engines, and salt spray. Around Genda, pilots and deck crews were celebrating. Men were embracing each other, shouting, laughing with the relief and euphoria that comes after surviving combat. The tension that had gripped the task force for 12 days had finally broken. They had done it. They had struck the Americans and survived. The attack had been devastating beyond anyone's expectations. 4 American battleships sunk outright. The Arizona had exploded with such force that debris had rained down across Ford Island a quarter-mile away. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, rolling 150 degrees to port, trapping more than 400 men inside her hull. The West Virginia and California had settled to the bottom of the harbor, their superstructures still visible above water, but their hulls shattered by torpedo hits. 4 more battleships were damaged so badly they looked like total losses. The Nevada had tried to get underway during the attack and was beached to prevent her from sinking in the harbor channel. The Pennsylvania sat in dry dock, damaged but repairable. The Maryland and Tennessee were trapped behind capsized ships, their decks torn by bomb hits. 18 ships in total, destroyed or crippled. 2,403 Americans dead, hundreds more wounded. Japan had lost only 29 aircraft out of 353 launched, 9 Zero fighters, 5 torpedo bombers, and 15 dive bombers, losses of barely 8%. By any measure of combat effectiveness, it was an overwhelming victory. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the airstrike, landed on Akagi's deck and reported to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo that the mission was a complete success. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled. The way was clear for Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia. The pilots were jubilant, exhausted, talking over each other about what they had seen and done. But Genda stood apart from the celebration. He was 37 years old, one of the most brilliant aviation tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had spent 11 months since January 1941 working under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to design every aspect of this operation: training schedules, attack formations, target priorities, and ordnance loads. The numbers running through his head told a different story than the celebration suggested, a story about mathematics and oil barrels and industrial capacity. A story about logistical calculations that had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. A story that meant Japan had just won a devastating tactical victory while simultaneously guaranteeing its strategic defeat. The problem was not the battleships. Everyone was fixated on the battleships, these massive steel fortresses burning and sinking in the harbor. But Genda knew battleships were becoming obsolete. The future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines, not to slow-moving gun platforms that could be destroyed by aircraft they could never reach. The real problem, the fatal problem, was what the Japanese aircraft had not attacked. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. 49 massive cylindrical tanks stood in 3 separate facilities, built over decades as the Navy expanded operations in Hawaii. The lower tank farm, constructed between 1913 and 1923, held approximately 1,400,000 barrels in 22 tanks of varying sizes. The original 5 tanks built in 1913 held 35,000 to 50,000 barrels each.
Additional construction in 1923 added 17 more tanks with 50,000-barrel capacity each. The middle tank farm held roughly 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper tank farm, the largest of the three facilities, held about 2,500,000 barrels in 17 tanks, each with 150,000-barrel capacity. Together, they constituted the entire fuel supply for the United States Pacific Fleet.
Admiral Chester Nimitz would later state that Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, and all of it was vulnerable to .50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks were built for peacetime efficiency, not wartime security. They sat above ground, visible from the air, clustered together to minimize piping distances. They were optimized for operations, not survivability. The tanks were clearly visible from the air. Japanese reconnaissance had identified them. Takeo Yoshikawa, operating under the alias Tadashi Morimura from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, had spent months observing Pearl Harbor. He watched ships come and go, counted aircraft at the naval air stations, noted the locations of dry docks and repair facilities. He reported weekly on American fleet movements and base infrastructure through coded messages sent via commercial telegraph. The Japanese attack planners knew about the fuel storage. The tanks were extraordinarily vulnerable. Their walls were made of thin steel plate designed to hold liquid under atmospheric pressure, not to resist military action. The steel was thick enough to contain fuel oil, nothing more. An armor-piercing bomb, even a smaller 500-pound bomb, would rupture a tank completely. The fuel inside would pour out and ignite. Fuel oil is not as volatile as gasoline. It does not explode spectacularly, but it burns intensely and persistently. A ruptured fuel tank would create a massive fire that would burn for days or even weeks. The heat from one burning tank would be intense enough to rupture adjacent tanks even without direct hits. Fire would spread from tank to tank across the entire farm. Once the first tank was breached and burning, the entire storage complex would be doomed. All 4.5 million barrels would be destroyed. The Pacific Fleet carried approximately 760,000 barrels of fuel in its oilers and ship bunkers combined. That was less than 1/6 of the total stored at Pearl Harbor. In the first 9 days after the attack, the fleet expended approximately 750,000 barrels conducting search operations, looking for the Japanese carriers, and securing approaches to Hawaii. The fleet had burned through nearly its entire seaborne fuel capacity in just over a week. Without the shore-based storage at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet would have been completely immobilized. If those tanks had been destroyed, the consequences would have been catastrophic for American naval operations. The United States Pacific Fleet would have been forced to abandon Pearl Harbor as a forward base. Every ship would have had to withdraw to the West Coast, to San Diego, San Francisco, or Seattle, more than 2,000 miles away. From California, American ships would have needed twice as much fuel to reach the Western Pacific war zones. A destroyer that could operate for 10 days in the Philippines when based at Pearl Harbor could only operate for 4 days when based in San Diego because it would burn most of its fuel just traveling to and from the operational area.
The operational range of every American warship would have been cut in half. The ability to conduct sustained operations west of Midway would have been crippled. American interference with Japanese conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would have been impossible for at least 12 to 18 months, possibly longer. The United States would have needed years to rebuild storage capacity in Hawaii. 4.5 million barrels of fuel storage cannot be constructed quickly. Each tank required engineering, construction, and testing. Support infrastructure had to be built: pumping stations, pipelines, loading facilities, and fire suppression systems. The entire logistics chain would have needed reconstruction from scratch under wartime conditions while fighting a two-ocean war. But the Japanese aircraft never attacked the oil tanks. Not one bomb was dropped on them. The attack plan did not include the fuel storage facilities as a priority target. Pilots had not been briefed on their importance. No ordnance had been allocated for their destruction. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes focused exclusively on battleships, big, dramatic targets that looked strategically important but were actually rapidly becoming obsolete. The aircraft carriers, the submarines, the repair facilities, the dry docks, and most critically, the fuel storage, all of these truly important targets were either absent that morning or deliberately ignored in favor of sinking battleships. This was not an accident. It was the direct result of fundamental miscalculations about the nature of modern naval warfare made months earlier during the planning phase. Miscalculations about fuel consumption, oil production, tanker capacity, and how long Japan could sustain a war without access to American oil imports.
Captain Kuroshima was known as one of the most intellectually brilliant officers in the Navy. He had an unusual reputation. He sometimes worked naked in his cabin, claiming that clothes distracted him from strategic thinking. He consumed vast quantities of rice and almost nothing else. He could recite from memory the fuel capacity and cruising range of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical calculation. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer depended entirely on oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum. In peacetime, Japan consumed approximately 32 to 37 million barrels per year for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most of that oil came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo imposed on July 26, 1941, following Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina, had cut off Japan's primary supply source. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed with their own embargoes. Japan was suddenly cut off from more than 80% of its oil imports. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves, distributed between Navy stocks, Army stocks, and civilian reserves mandated by 1934 legislation. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations. That translated to approximately 69,600 barrels per day, or 25.4 million barrels per year, just for the Navy. Add Army consumption and civilian needs, and Japan was burning through its entire 50 million barrel reserve at an alarming rate. Without new sources of oil, Japan would run out of fuel for military operations sometime in 1943. The nation faced two choices: capitulate to American demands, which would require withdrawing from China and abandoning the entire Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, or go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war. But that choice required answering the fundamental question: could Japan win a war against the United States before running out of fuel? That calculation involved three critical assumptions. Each assumption seemed reasonable. Each was supported by historical precedent, military doctrine, or intelligence analysis. Each proved catastrophically wrong. First assumption: the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans were accustomed to comfort, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, they would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia. This assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability did not matter. Second assumption: Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine that had defined strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima.
The combined fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west. There would be one or two major fleet engagements where Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in climactic surface actions. This meant most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor, consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be actively operating at any time. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, and relatively low. Third assumption: capturing the Dutch Indies oil fields would solve Japan's supply problem permanently. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing those fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. The mathematics appeared sound, the strategy seemed viable. In September 1941, with 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the numbers suggested Japan could sustain a war. But every assumption was wrong, and the mathematical errors built into those assumptions would doom Japan before the first shot was fired. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate after 6 months. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor not with defeatism, but with furious determination. President Franklin Roosevelt's declaration that December 7th would live in infamy united the country. American industrial capacity shifted to total war production. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels began building warships. Factories that produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. The entire economy mobilized. The conflict would last 3 years and 8 months, not 6 months.
Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. The Pacific War became something entirely different from what Japanese planners anticipated. It involved continuous operations across vast distances, carrier task forces conducting raids on enemy bases thousands of miles from home, submarines operating on extended patrols hunting convoys, amphibious assaults on scattered islands requiring massive escort forces, and destroyers constantly shuttling between bases escorting supply convoys. Every operation required constant movement, constant maneuvering, and constant fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. Consider the scale of operations. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots cruising speed consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel oil per day. That same destroyer conducting high-speed operations at 25 to 30 knots consumed 300 to 400 tons per day. Combat operations were never conducted at cruising speed. They were conducted at maximum or near maximum speed. That meant fuel consumption rates 3 to 4 times higher than peacetime planning assumptions. A destroyer on a combat deployment might spend 2 weeks traveling to an operational area, 1 week conducting combat operations, then 2 weeks returning. During the combat week, it would consume as much fuel as it normally consumed in 3 to 4 weeks of peacetime cruising. The planning assumptions that estimated fuel based on average cruising speeds were completely divorced from reality. Multiply this across the fleet. By mid-1942, Japan was operating dozens of destroyers simultaneously on various missions, each one burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption. Add cruisers, which consumed even more. Add carriers and their air groups. Add battleships, massive fuel hogs that burned hundreds of tons per day even at moderate speeds. Add submarines. Add fleet oilers which consumed fuel while delivering fuel. The total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. The actual numbers told the story. Japanese military consumption in fiscal year 1942, which ran from April 1943 through March 1943, totaled 41.79 million barrels. Planning estimates had assumed 35 to 40 million barrels. The actual consumption was at the high end of estimates during a year when major operations were still ramping up. As the war intensified, consumption would only increase. Fiscal year 1943 consumption reached 43.99 million barrels. This was during the height of Japanese operations in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The assumptions that fuel consumption would be manageable and predictable proved completely wrong. Japan was burning oil at rates that exhausted reserves far faster than anticipated. Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged. Allied defenders, knowing they could not hold the territory, had systematically destroyed as much production capacity as possible before retreating or surrendering.
At Balikpapan, in Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing regions in Southeast Asia, Dutch engineers had demolished key facilities before the Japanese arrived. They blew up pumping stations with dynamite. They destroyed storage tanks. They set wells on fire, creating massive blazes that burned for weeks. They dumped concrete down drill holes, rendering wells inoperable. They removed critical components from refinery equipment and threw them into rivers or buried them. They sabotaged electrical systems and damaged pipelines. The sabotage was not complete. Japanese forces moved quickly enough to capture some facilities relatively intact, but overall damage was substantial. Even facilities that appeared intact often had subtle damage: missing parts, damaged seals, compromised safety systems, equipment that looked functional but would fail under operation. Restoring production required skilled technicians Japan did not have in sufficient numbers. The Netherlands and Britain had developed sophisticated petroleum engineering expertise over decades of operating these fields. Japan's petroleum industry, by comparison, was tiny. Japan's domestic oil production from fields in Akita and Niigata totaled only about 3 million barrels annually. The entire Japanese petroleum engineering sector was perhaps 1/10 the size of what the Dutch and British had deployed in the East Indies. Most Dutch and British petroleum engineers had been evacuated before Japanese forces arrived. Those who remained and were captured were imprisoned rather than put to work. Using enemy nationals to operate critical war industries raised security concerns. Language barriers created complications. Japanese military authorities distrusted the loyalties of captured personnel. Japan had to send petroleum engineers from the home islands to operate the captured fields. But finding qualified people was difficult. Universities had not trained petroleum engineers in large numbers because Japan had virtually no domestic oil industry. Mining engineers could be retrained for some tasks. Chemical engineers understood refinery processes. But the specialized knowledge required to operate tropical oil fields efficiently, to maintain production without damaging reservoirs, to solve problems that arose during operations, that knowledge was scarce. Equipment was even more problematic than personnel. Oilfield equipment is specialized, heavy, difficult to transport, and impossible to improvise. Drilling rigs weigh hundreds of tons and require specialized transportation. Refinery components are precisely manufactured and cannot be easily replaced. Pumping equipment must match specific well characteristics. Pipelines must be properly sized and routed. Storage tanks must meet capacity requirements.
Japan needed to ship replacement equipment from the home islands, but Japanese merchant shipping was already stretched thin. The same ships that needed to carry oil from the captured fields to Japan also needed to carry equipment to those fields. Ships traveling south carried drilling equipment, refinery components, and pumping machinery. Ships traveling north carried crude oil and refined products. But there were never enough ships to do both adequately. Moreover, merchant ships were increasingly targeted by American submarines. Every ship sunk carrying equipment south meant production in the oil fields could not be restored. Every ship sunk carrying oil north meant less fuel reached Japan. The submarines created a perfect trap. Japan needed equipment to restore production and ships to transport oil. But the same submarine campaign that sunk oil tankers also sunk the equipment vessels needed to restore production capacity. Production in the captured territories struggled to reach pre-war levels. In 1940, before the Japanese invasion, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, after Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels. That was less than 40% of pre-war production, achieved despite major efforts to restore facilities. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels represented oil that did not exist, that could not be captured, that could not help Japan win the war. Japanese planners had assumed they would quickly restore full production. They assumed 65 million barrels per year would be available. They based the entire war strategy on that assumption, but actual production was less than half that level. In 1943, production improved to 49.6 million barrels as restoration efforts continued and more facilities came back online. That was 76% of pre-war levels, a significant achievement. But by then, the tanker shortage had become critical. The oil fields were producing, but the oil could not reach Japan. This was the third catastrophic error in Japanese planning. Japanese strategists had not adequately calculated how much shipping capacity would be required to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, and, more critically, how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine warfare. The geography of the problem was unforgiving. The distance from Borneo to Japan is approximately 2,000 nautical miles. From Sumatra, it is even farther. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had a cargo capacity of about 10,000 tons deadweight, which translated to roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At a cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, which was economical for tanker operations, the round trip from Borneo to Japan took approximately 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time.
That meant a single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering approximately 975,000 barrels annually if it operated continuously without losses or major delays. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in captured territories in 1943, Japan needed approximately 50 tankers in continuous operation dedicated solely to oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies. That did not include tankers needed for moving oil between Japanese ports, tankers supporting naval operations at sea, tankers carrying aviation fuel, or tankers that would inevitably be damaged, under repair, or sunk. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport, totaling about 500,000 gross tons. That number included both Navy tankers and civilian tankers requisitioned for military use. It was barely sufficient for peacetime needs when oil could be purchased from nearby sources and domestic production supplemented imports. For war, with all oil coming from distant conquered territories, it was catastrophically inadequate. Building new tankers required shipyard capacity and construction time. A tanker took approximately 8 to 10 months to build, from keel laying to delivery. But Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building warships. Every month, shipyards were launching destroyers, submarines, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. The Navy General Staff and the government prioritized combat vessels over support vessels. Tankers were unglamorous. They did not sink enemy ships. They did not win battles. They just carried oil. The priority always went to warships. Between December 1941 and December 1943, Japanese shipyards focused on warship construction. Some tankers were built, but not nearly enough to replace losses. Meanwhile, American submarines were systematically destroying Japan's tanker fleet in what became one of the most successful submarine campaigns in naval history. American submarines operated under a doctrine specifically targeting Japanese logistics. Tankers were priority targets. Every tanker sunk represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan. Submarines lurked along tanker routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan. They waited near choke points. Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Formosa became known as a submarine killing ground. Tankers had to pass through to reach Japan from the south. Submarines waited there, in ambush. The impact was devastating. Every tanker sunk meant less oil transported.
But the effects cascaded beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker lost meant remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack. It created a death spiral where each loss made the remaining tankers more vulnerable. Furthermore, tanker crews became increasingly demoralized as losses mounted. Sailing on a tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Japanese merchant marine. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, and often sailed with inadequate escorts because destroyers were needed elsewhere. Crews knew they were priority targets. The psychological toll affected operations even when tankers survived their voyages. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine operating areas. Routes that should have taken 4 weeks began taking 5 or 6 weeks as captains zigzagged, hugged coastlines, and waited in protected anchorages for escorts. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil transported, even by surviving tankers. The submarine threat reduced effective tanker capacity even beyond actual sinkings. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japanese oil imports began declining, not because production in the conquered territories was falling, but because the shipping to transport that oil was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japanese oil supplies. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical reality of Japan's fuel crisis was becoming undeniable. Japanese oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to approximately 38 million barrels. The decline of 12 million barrels in 7 months represented a burn rate far exceeding peacetime projections. The Navy alone was consuming approximately 2.4 million barrels per month, significantly above planning estimates that had assumed 1.5 to 2 million barrels monthly. Admiral Yamamoto received detailed reports about the fuel situation in May 1942 as he prepared for the operation against Midway. The numbers were alarming. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions about oil production in captured territories and successful tanker voyages, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-1943 if consumption remained at current levels or increased further. The Naval General Staff held a series of emergency meetings in Tokyo throughout the summer and fall of 1942 to discuss the fuel crisis. Minutes from these meetings reveal growing concern and increasingly desperate proposals. Every solution discussed had fundamental problems that made implementation difficult or impossible. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dropped to approximately 15 million barrels, less than a third of pre-war levels. American submarines had devastated the tanker fleet. Ships that survived faced dangerous waters and took circuitous routes, burning much of their cargo as fuel for their own engines. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range. They could not maneuver freely because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, by contrast, had virtually unlimited fuel. They were supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers that gave them complete operational freedom. The difference was not about courage or skill. It was about mathematics. America had the oil and the tankers to deliver it. Japan had neither. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Most tankers had been sunk. The few that survived could barely operate. Many ships sat at anchor with empty fuel bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese forces made a desperate sortie that consumed most of their remaining fuel reserves. The operation was not designed as a one-way mission, but severe fuel shortages meant ships could barely return to port afterward. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato made her final sortie to Okinawa. Operation Tengo was explicitly designed as a suicide mission. Orders called for minimal fuel, just enough to reach Okinawa, where the ship would beach itself and fight as a stationary gun platform. Local base commanders at Tokuyama secretly provided more fuel than the bare minimum orders specified, approximately 60% of full capacity rather than just enough for a one-way trip. This act of defiance showed how controversial the suicide mission was even within the Japanese Navy. But even 60% fuel was probably insufficient for a return voyage. Yamato was sunk by American aircraft on April 7, 1945. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, oil reserves were effectively exhausted. The combined fleet was immobilized. Most major warships had been sunk, but those that survived sat in port with empty bunkers. The oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo because there were no tankers left to transport it. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit it could never overcome, a deficit that existed before the war started, a deficit that was predictable and calculatable from the mathematics of consumption versus supply. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the very beginning. On January 7, 1941, before the planning for Pearl Harbor had even begun in earnest, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. In that letter, Yamamoto stated clearly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was vastly greater. American oil production was hundreds of times larger than Japan's domestic production. If the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months, Japan would face inevitable defeat. Yamamoto wrote that the only possibility of success was a quick knockout blow that might shock the Americans into negotiating a settlement. But even that possibility was remote because Americans historically did not surrender after initial defeats. They became more determined, not less. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would actually achieve a decisive strategic result. He knew the mathematics did not support a Japanese victory. But Yamamoto was trapped by the same institutional pressures that shaped all Japanese planning. He could express doubts in private letters. He could make pessimistic predictions in conversations with trusted colleagues. But he could not publicly refuse to plan the operation. That would have been seen as insubordination, as disloyalty, as undermining national unity. His career would have been destroyed, and someone else would have been appointed to design the attack.
So Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would probably fail strategically, hoping desperately that somehow the Americans would react differently than history suggested. On the morning of December 7th, when Commander Genda stood on Akagi's deck, watching the second wave return, he understood all of this. He knew the fuel tanks had not been attacked. He knew they should have been attacked. He knew that leaving them intact was a tactical error that cost Japan months of operational advantage. But Genda also knew something else. Even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if Pearl Harbor had been rendered completely useless, even if the American Pacific Fleet had been forced to withdraw to California, the mathematics still did not work. Japan still did not have enough oil to win. Fuel consumption rates were still too high. Tanker capacity was still too low. Captured oil fields could not produce enough to meet demand. Destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks would have delayed American offensive operations by perhaps 6 to 12 months, but it would not have changed the outcome. The outcome was determined by mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels of oil per year minimum to sustain military operations at the intensity required to fight the United States. Japan had access to approximately 25 to 30 million barrels per year from all sources combined, after accounting for transportation losses.
The deficit was 10 to 15 million barrels per year. No amount of tactical brilliance, fighting spirit, or superior training could overcome a deficit of 10 to 15 million barrels per year. Industrial wars cannot be fought without industrial resources. Naval operations cannot be sustained without fuel. And arithmetic cannot be wished away because the numbers are politically inconvenient.
That was the fatal error that doomed Japan. Not the tactical decision to focus on battleships instead of fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor. Not the operational decision to withdraw after 2 waves instead of launching a 3rd strike. The fatal error was going to war in the first place, based on assumptions about fuel consumption, oil production, and tanker capacity that were demonstrably wrong. Assumptions made by planners who prioritized what leadership wanted to hear over what the mathematics actually said. The fundamental lesson is simple but profound. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are not won by superior tactics or better training. They are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by resources, by the unglamorous mathematics of how much fuel you have versus how much fuel you need. Japan needed 40 million barrels per year. Japan had 25 million barrels per year. The war was lost in that arithmetic. Everything else, all the battles and all the sacrifice and all the tactical brilliance, was just the working out of mathematical inevitability. When nations ignore mathematics because it contradicts political goals, when institutions suppress analysis because it challenges approved strategies, when leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result is not just defeat, it is a catastrophe. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten histories that reveal how wars are won and lost, not by generals and admirals, but by the mathematics of logistics that everyone else ignores. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the world, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.